Now, before I start today's episode, I just wanted to tell you that the Great War team is producing the ultimate documentary about the Battle of Berlin in World War II. You can find out more at indiegogo.com or check the first comment in the comments section below. And now, on to the show. It's September 1919, and the confused, back and forth fighting in the Baltic region of the former Russian Empire continues. German Freikorps units who had remained after the November 1918 armistice are now formally dissolved. But instead of going home, they prepare to march again. Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. By the summer of 1919, the fighting in the Baltics had ravaged the region and confirmed the independence of the new republics of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. The first half of the year had seen clashes amongst the Bolsheviks, the forces of the three republics, the Royal Navy in the Baltic Sea, and local Baltic German militias and Freikorps. By early July, an armistice had been signed at the insistence of the Allies, and the German Freikorps were ordered by the government in Berlin to withdraw. But, as usual in the post-1918 chaos, it wouldn't quite work out that way. The late summer and fall of 1919 would be no less of a mess than the first half of the year. So let's start with the strange story of the Germans in the Baltics. Now, up until that summer, they'd been loosely organized as a militia of local Baltic Germans and Freikorps units, known as the Iron Division, under the command of Rüdiger von der Goltz. After their defeat by the troops loyal to the Republican governments of Estonia and Latvia at Cesis in June, the Freikorps had agreed to withdraw, but instead, many stayed put around the town of Jelgava. But the Entente feared a German Bolshevik coalition in Eastern Europe, which, given the fact that the Germans had brought Lenin to Russia to instigate the revolution in 1917, didn't seem too far-fetched to many at the time. The British and French therefore threatened to resume blockading Germany if it didn't force von der Goltz's men to leave. But the German authorities were divided on how to proceed. The Army High Command and Chancellor Ebert did call on German forces in the Baltics to return, but many key politicians quietly turned a blind eye to what was about to happen. You see, many Freikorpsmen had been fighting for land, which they understood had been promised to them by their former allies in the Latvian government. They began to reorganize in secret, and when the Latvian government of Kāles Ulmanis declared that they would not be granted citizenship in July, thousands gathered to lay claim to land they felt they'd earned by fighting the Bolsheviks. Von der Goltz told the German government in Berlin they intended to form a, quote, military settler state. On August 24th, von der Goltz returned from lobbying in Berlin to find that the first troops scheduled to return to Germany had mutinied and refused to leave. Now, the mutiny was led by German officers Josef Bischof and Heinz Guderian. The Germans felt betrayed by both Latvia, which refused them land and citizenship, and Germany, which they felt had abandoned them and had fallen under socialist rule. Berlin was not pleased, but its demands that the mutineers return home were simply ignored. But the revitalized Freikorps could not declare itself openly, due to Allied and Weimar German opposition. Instead, to hide the mostly German character of the force, it was christened, oddly enough, the West Russian Volunteer Army, not to be confused with the Northwestern White Russian Army operating nearby in Petrograd. Now, the West Russian Volunteer Army was formerly under the command of Great War and Russian Civil War veteran Cossack commander Pavel Bermont-Avalov. According to one observer, Bermont liked to think of himself as a dashing adventurer, a great, if syphilitic, lover, and a brilliant military leader. But although the so-called Bermontists did include some rather uninterested Russian prisoners released by the Germans, it was a mostly German formation, and Bermont himself was a mere figurehead. Some in the force did dream of restoring a Russian empire in which they could settle as landowners, while others wanted to preserve German power in the Baltics, and some were simply spoiling for a fight. On September 17th, German forces officially came under Bermont's command. When Ebert sent yet another demand for them to return, von der Goltz simply told him there were no German forces left. Now, estimates as to the strength of the Bermontians vary from 14,000 to 22,000 fighting men, about 80% of whom were Germans. So, by September, there was a phantom White Russian force in Latvia consisting mostly of German Freikorps. They were eager to fight, and bishops announced to the men that they would march on Riga and reclaim the lands that they'd been promised. On October 4th, the Bermontists moved on Riga and demanded entry into the city to transit to Russia. The Latvian government refused, and Bermont attacked the city on October 8th, despite the cold, rain, and wind. Now, the two sides were more or less evenly matched, with the Bermontists fielding about 8,500 men and the Latvians between 6,500 and 9,000. Now, thanks to an agreement signed back in July, the Estonians provided the Latvians some assistance, including tanks and armored trains, and their troops guarded a stretch of the river outside the city. Aircraft and poison gas were used in the attack, and the Bermontists attempted to seize the bridges on the Daugava to cut off the Latvian line of retreat. The Latvians rushed in reinforcements from the east, where they were facing the Bolsheviks. Now, after back and forth fighting, the Bermontists took one bank of the Daugava on the 10th and began to advance downriver. Expecting Riga to fall, Ulmanis's government escaped to Cesis, and some Latvian soldiers also fled, and some looting took place. But the city did not fall. In addition to the Latvian soldiers who remained, Estonian tanks had intervened at a crucial moment, and the attackers had limited ammunition for their artillery. Some residents also volunteered to fight or to prepare defenses, and morale soon recovered. An emergency battalion of students, civil servants, and firemen damaged the bridges at night in order to prevent an enemy crossing. Ulmanis returned, alongside 4 Estonian armored trains. But sporadic bombardment of the city continued, and the fighting bogged down for some 4 weeks, during which time the guns of the Royal Navy ships supported the Latvian Republic and cut off German shipping and supply routes. On October 15th, following an ultimatum, the Royal Navy fired on a German fort, allegedly in response to German fire directed at their ships. Finding it, quote, silly to blow the enemy out of the fort and not occupy it, the Latvians agreed to make an amphibious assault. Here's how one British sailor described it. A large collection of ferry boats, pleasure steamers, launches and tugs, crowded with troops, came down the river and made for the fort under our barrage, which lifted at the proper time. The crews of all these craft were women, and they handled them well. We weighed anchor and steamed slowly up the river, shooting at the Germans who were bolting across the country pursued by the Lets, who took 300 prisoners. This action helped stop the main assault on the southern bank of the river. Now, at this point, Bermont offered the Latvians a ceasefire if they would help him attack Bolshevik Russia, an offer that the Latvians simply ignored. On November 4th, the Bermontists attacked the town of Liepāja with 8,000 men. The small Latvian garrison of 2,000 defended the town as best it could, but by the 14th, the Bermontists had taken the outer defenses. The Royal Navy intervened again, and naval gunfire in support of the Latvians turned the tide. One British sailor recalled, "As soon as the Germans started to run, the men of Liepāja went after them by cart, car, tram, or anything on wheels, armed with anything from rifles to spades and pickaxes."
You know, the Royal Navy wasn't the only actor in the Baltic Sea in 1919, right?
Oh, hi Drach, nice of you to stop by. I do know a bit more about the naval military history of the region, but it's already tough to pack all the events on land into just one video.
Well, such a coincidence then. I just released a video detailing the naval warfare conducted in the Baltic Sea in 1919.
Yes, what a coincidence. Well, I'll check out your video, and I'm sure that our fans will be interested as well. See ya!
Thanks very much. See you later.
Now, generally speaking, between Latvians and Germans, few prisoners were taken, but the Latvians often spared the Russian Bermontists, since most were more eager to hold political meetings than to fight. 18-year-old Freikorpsman Rudolf Höss, who would later become Auschwitz's first commandant, recalled, "The fighting in the Baltic was more savage and desperate than anything else in all the Freikorps fighting I saw before or afterwards. There was no real front to speak of. The enemy was everywhere. And whenever there was a clash, it turned into butchery to the extent of total annihilation." So although the fighting had bogged down in front of Riga, the tide had begun to turn at Liepāja, and now the Latvian Republic would go over to the attack once and for all. Now, back in Riga, on November 11th, the Latvians had attacked along the Daugava, outflanking and surprising the enemy, who swiftly retreated. the Bermontists were nearly surrounded at Jelgava, but were saved at the last minute by the 1,000-strong Rosbach Freikorps, which arrived after a forced march from East Prussia through Lithuania, against orders from Berlin. Now, after these defeats, von der Goltz asked for his men to officially be allowed to join the German army, and the Germans requested an armistice. But the Latvians and Lithuanians ignored the armistice request, and the Latvians even declared war on Germany on November 26th. Now, as the defeated Bermontists retreated towards the Lithuanian border, the Freikorpsmen left a trail of destruction. They torched Jelgava before they left, and spared no one they came across. According to historian Robert Waite, the soldiers of the Iron Division and the German Legion unloaded all their despair and fury in one wild power blow against the Latvians. As villages burst into flames, prisoners were trampled underfoot in chaotic revenge and destructive joy. The leaders were powerless or else looked on with grim approval. Now, during the retreat, many Freikorpsmen were executed by their own officers for plundering, which some have seen as a foreshadowing of 1945. At the end of November, the last Bermontists left Latvia and entered Lithuania. The Latvians wanted to pursue the enemy across the border, but the Entente pressured them to stay put. Now, the French attempted to negotiate a ceasefire, but the Lithuanian army attacked and chased the Germans into East Prussia by mid-December. So, the Freikorps army of the so-called White Russians had been beaten after months of bitter fighting. But while all this was going on, the Bolshevik Red Army and Allied forces were still facing each other, and this front was not quiet either. In fact, there were Germans on this front too, who had chosen a different path than the Freikorps Bermontists. After the Battle of Cesis and the ensuing armistice, the Baltic German militia, known as the Landeswehr, was placed under the command of 27-year-old British Colonel Harold Alexander. They were stationed facing the Bolsheviks and remained loyal to Alexander rather than marching to aid the Bermontist attack on Riga. Of course, it didn't hurt that the Latvian Republic had intercepted messages between the Bermontist and the Landeswehr, so any mutiny would have been swiftly crushed. But the Landeswehr was one small part of the activity on the front, which saw active fighting on sea and on land. In the Baltic, the Royal Navy launched several daring raids against the Soviet fleet based at Kronstadt, near Petrograd. On August 17th, 8 small craft attacked the base at night, with Finnish smugglers showing the British the way. Simultaneously, Sopwith camels from the aircraft carrier HMS Vindictive also attacked. The planes did little damage, since they were inexperienced at night bombing, but they distracted the defenders from the torpedo threat from the boats. The British managed to sink the Bolsheviks' 2 biggest ships, a dreadnought and an older battleship, against the loss of just 3 of the coastal attack boats. Lieutenant Gordon Steele described his boat's attack. Then there was another terrific explosion nearby. We received a great shock and a douche of water. I realized that the cause of it was one of our torpedoes exploding the side of the battleship. We were so close to her that a shower of picric acid from the warhead of our torpedo was thrown over the stern of the boat, staining us a yellow color which we had some difficulty in removing afterwards. In addition to raiding Kronstadt, the British also snuck into Petrograd several times to make contact with their secret agent, Paul Dukes. A concert pianist by training, he helped hundreds of whites escape to Finland, infiltrated the Cheka, and was conscripted into the Red Army. Eventually, he escaped through the lines in Latvia and made it back to Britain, with his information preserved on toilet paper. Then he was knighted, only in 1919. So, the Royal Navy had crippled the Soviet fleet for now. Let's head inland and see what's happening there. Along the line between the Estonian Republic and Bolshevik Russia, there was another unusual situation. A different White Russian army, this time actually consisting of White Russians, was sandwiched more or less between the two sides since the late spring. The Northwestern Army, under General Yudenich, had the lukewarm support of the British and the downright reluctant support of the Estonian Republic, which distrusted the Whites but hated the Bolsheviks even more. Estonian troops and artillery and British and Estonian ships supported the White Russian attack on Petrograd in October. Once the attack failed, the White Russians retreated back into Estonia. and the Estonian army promptly disarmed all the soldiers who refused to fight alongside them, fearing chaos caused by the disorganized soldiers and their leaders, who were not on good terms with the Estonian authorities. Those who did not join Estonian units were put in labor detachments. Now, the White Russians and the refugees with them were in a sorry state. One Estonian newspaper reported, "One can see on the streets of Narva human shadows roaming around with vacant faces. These are the soldiers of this former army, utterly defeated by hunger and disease. Their greatcoats have been burned off from the hem to the waist at the campfires while they were sleeping off their exhaustion, unaware that their clothes were on fire. One group has not seen food for several days. One of the soldiers has frostbitten feet and barely creeps along with the help of another soldier, exhausted by hunger." The White Russians still able to fight were incorporated into the Estonian 1st Division, alongside minority Ingrians and Baltic Germans. Now, although Lenin ordered Trotsky not to pursue the Northwest Army into Estonia, fighting continued. The Bolsheviks launched their offensive on November 16th. The Estonian defenses in the north were based on prepared positions, but the Red Army advanced, following the heaviest bombardment yet seen in the Baltic fighting. By November 25th, the Estonians had been forced back to their second line of defense. The town of Narva was nearly surrounded, but its 20,000 Estonian and White Russian defenders held out. The constant attacks had drained the Red Army, and by November 31st, the Red 7th Army was too exhausted even to mount a proper defensive deployment. Now, in the southern sector, Estonian defenses were weaker, and the Red Army broke through to the Narva River and managed to cross the frozen surface several times. But each time, the Estonians pushed them back. Fighting reached a fever pitch after peace negotiations began on December 5th, as the Bolsheviks fought to improve their position. The last week of December, the Red Army launched a final attack, and when it also failed, an armistice was declared on December 31st, which came into effect January 3rd. Now, this series of battles is known to Estonians as the Estonian Verdun, and some historians have compared the character of the fighting, with artillery barrages pounding enemy trenches, barbed wire and bunkers, to the Western Front. All right, so much for the Estonians and the Reds, but further south, the Latvians were also facing off with the Bolshevik armies. The front between the Latvian Republic and Bolshevik Russia was quiet for most of the second half of 1919, since both armies had their hands full with other enemies. There was no defined front line, just some fortified outposts at regular intervals, which saw frequent raids and skirmishes. But things changed dramatically on December 30th, as Latvia and Poland signed an alliance and attacked the province of Latgale, which was under Red Army control. Historically, the region had for a time been part of a previous Polish state, but now Poland wanted to ensure the land went to Latvia rather than Lithuania, with whom the Poles were also fighting. Some 33,000 Latvian troops, 6,000 Landeswehr, and 20,000 Poles took part in the offensive. Local guerrilla fighters also harassed Red supply lines and communications in the forested region. In a sign of the times, the Landeswehr, consisting of Baltic Germans, under command of a British officer, went into battle alongside Poles and Latvians against Russian Bolsheviks, only in 1919. Now, on January 5th, the Latvian-Polish force took Latgale's largest city, Daugavpils. The Red Army tried to make a last stand, but they were forced to evacuate under cover of an armored train. Eventually, an armistice was declared February 1st. So, as 1919 ended and 1920 began, a hint of stability began to take shape in Estonia and Latvia. The fighting had largely ended, and peace treaties would come later in the year, but not without difficulty. An August agreement by the Baltic states to negotiate a joint peace with the Soviet Union had gone nowhere, and Estonians referred to negotiating with the Soviets as, quote, dancing with the devil's grandmother. But the situation in the region was still unstable. British sailors were war-weary and near mutiny, and the blockade of Bolshevik Russia had ended. Lithuania and Poland were still fighting, as were Poland and Russia. The Baltic states had consolidated their independence in 1919, but with a neighbor as powerful and as unstable as war-torn Russia, the future was far from clear. So now that we've hopefully made some sense of the fighting in the Baltics until the end of 1919, it's time for our roundup segment, where we take a look at what else is going on in September 1919. And as usual, we will start in Eastern Europe. In Russia, General Denikin's armed forces of South Russia finally began the drive on Moscow aimed at defeating the Bolsheviks. Progress was good, and the Whites captured Kursk and Voronezh before the month was out. In the east, Admiral Kolchak's White Army, on the run since April, hit back with a counteroffensive that temporarily pushed back the Reds. On the 21st, Lithuanian authorities quashed a second Polish coup attempt to establish a Polish-friendly government. On the 10th, near Paris, the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was signed between the Republic of Austria and the Allies. It set the borders of much of Central Europe and forbid Austrian union with Germany. On the 12th, Italian nationalist Gabriele D'Annunzio and his followers entered Fiume, which he declared he had annexed to Italy. But the Italian government opposed the action and blockaded the city. D'Annunzio's Impresa di Fiume, or March on Fiume, served as inspiration for Mussolini's March on Rome a few years later. On the 14th, the British government outlawed the revolutionary Irish Parliament. And on the 28th, a referendum took place in Luxembourg. The country voted to retain the monarchy and Grand Duchess Charlotte and for an economic union with France, though eventually it got one with Belgium instead. From September 4th to 11th, the Turkish national movement of Mustafa Kemal met in Sivas. The delegates attempted to unite Turkish resistance groups and the Ottoman government in Istanbul against the Allies. In the United States, throughout the month, the Red Summer continued and race riots occurred in New York, Omaha, and Elaine, Arkansas, where on September 30th, at least 100 blacks were killed in one of the deadliest outbreaks of racial violence in US history. And finally, on September 3rd, President Wilson began a tour of the country to gain support for the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. On the 25th, he was forced to return to Washington due to poor health. Now, as usual, you can find all our sources for this video in the video description, including links to our Amazon stores. Thanks to Kevin Axe, who did most of the research for this episode. To get access to all our podcasts, with expert interviews and other perks, you can also support us on Patreon or by clicking the Join button below. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1919, a production of real-time history and the only YouTube history channel that is not a fake White Russian army actually made up of German Freikorps running wild in the Baltic.